Hello, my name is Peter Ward, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some thoughts around supply chain fragility and particularly how we can start thinking about building some resilience into the logistics networks to support supply chains. Let me start with a very quick introduction. Some of you will know me as the former Chief Executive of the UK Warehousing Association, from which I retired a couple of months ago. And I've now taken up a slightly more plural role, hopefully sharing some of my 40 years experience in international supply chains and logistics in an advisory capacity. So what I'd like to do today to sort of set the scene really in terms of how our supply chains have been more fragile. Firstly, let's have a look at sort of the geopolitical landscape, what's going on out there around the world, sort of from a big picture point of view. And then, of course, talk about some of the impacts that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic and indeed Brexit. And then talk about some of the structural changes that are going on and will probably continue to go on in our logistics networks. And then we'll round off perhaps just looking at what those opportunities are, particularly in the third-party logistics sector, and some of the risks that need to be managed in capturing those opportunities. I think it's fair to say that around the world, things are very fragile. The globe itself, global logistics and supply chains, all suffering a degree of volatility and fragility. And of course, the news over the last few weeks has been dominated by the situation in Afghanistan. But of course, that whole aspect around the Middle East and the uncertainty and the fragility of the political landscape in the Middle East has been around for quite some time. Probably the biggest humanitarian crisis, actually, that we've known since the Second World War. And of course, just going around the pictures on the slide here, and we will talk a little bit about Brexit shortly. In spite of what we hear from the politicians, those of us that are practicing in the sector know that Brexit is not yet done, and there is a lot more change to come. And it remains to be seen, actually, whether the can will be kicked even further down the road with some further extensions to the promised changes coming in later this year and at the beginning of next year. And of course, the last 4 or 5 years really have been dominated by Brexit and, of course, the Trump effect on global trade. Trump himself being a great advocate, of course, of America first and ripping up the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, or at least America's part in that. And I guess we're sort of waiting now to see what is going to be President Biden's impact in terms of global trade and whether America is going to start opening its arms out again to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, if we look to the east, situation again very fragile around Hong Kong, the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, and yet the Chinese continue to invest in their Belt and Road Initiative, several times bigger than the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars being expanded into China, reaching out into the rest of the world in a westerly direction to increase its trade flows. And then, of course, we have the uncertainties of Korea. And whilst Afghanistan and other things have been dominating the news, I guess we're still waiting and wanting to know really what the Putin agenda is down in Ukraine and South Crimea and so on. Of course, all of this has had a quite dramatic effect over the last 5 or 6 years. Volatility around commodity pricing. We're seeing the price of fuel now really increasing. And we've seen a devaluation in the pound over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly after the result of the Brexit referendum. So lots of uncertainty, lots of fragility around the world. And of course, as we start to recover from the COVID pandemic, I guess the world is going to start turning its attention towards climate change and building sustainability into supply chains, which we'll perhaps touch on as we go forward. If we look at some of the current impacts and effects, particularly of the pandemic, we're a situation at the moment where, in short, lots of ships, containers, and stock all in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think we can trace this back to a degree to the start of a lockdown here in the spring of last year, when a lot of stock did not get out into the retail channels that it was destined for. So a huge backing up of stock, not to mention then the follow-on stocking up of PPE, which still sits around in the system. There's still several million pallet positions around the UK warehousing sector holding PPE. But around the world, ships, port congestion, ships in the wrong places, containers in the wrong places, factories whose production is held up or delayed. And all of this is having an impact now on global supply chains. And of course, the news here being dominated also by the shortage of lorry drivers and warehouse operatives, which is starting to have an impact on some of those daily supplies that we sometimes kind of take for granted. Another impact, of course, of the pandemic has been the shortage of air freight capacity. A lot of air freight moving around the world as belly hold cargo of passenger aircraft, but with the pandemic and the reduction in passenger aircraft moving, of course, air freight space and capacity therefore coming at a premium, and all of this driving huge price increases into the supply chain. And then when we look at some of the structural changes that's bringing about, well, I mean, supply chain essentially is not an over complex situation. Supply chain, really, if you boil it down, is about managing flow and capacity, and getting that balance around the required lead times or delivery times, and having to work out what volume of stock you need in the supply chain to maintain that constant flow to meet those lead time and delivery time targets. And clearly, if flow is interrupted at any point through increased bureaucracy, in the case of Brexit, for example, customs declarations, inspections, and so on, or for any other of the preceding reasons, vessels, containers, port congestion, and so on and so forth, then it's clear that to manage the same outcome, then you're going to need to put more capacity into the supply chain, more capacity being more inventory therefore requiring more warehousing. So I think this is really what's going on at the moment. And if you look at what's actually happening in the warehousing sector, particularly here in the UK, but across Europe as well, first half of 2021, transactions at a record level, over 25 million square feet of warehousing capacity taken up in the first half of 2021. And alongside that, an all-time low vacancy rate. So vacancy levels of vacant capacity available in the market on the supply side, somewhere around about 4%. And this is creating a real situation now where clearly demand for warehousing capacity is outstripping supply. And already the impact of that is starting to manifest itself in increased rental levels and so on. The other thing, as a result of this kind of factory and production slowdown, particularly in the Far East, is the material shortage. That's having an impact also on the speed at which new warehousing stock can come into the market. So steel, concrete shortages, and so on and so forth. Everything at the moment seems to be up in some degree of turmoil in terms of regularity and speed of supply. And I'm hearing from the experts in the real estate market that this is going to have a real impact actually on the speed at which new speculative capacity can be brought into the market. So with demand outgrowing supply, rent inflation starting to come through the system, and more companies now looking at managing this volatility of interruption of flow, interruption in the supply chain for all of these reasons, starting now to want to hold more stock close to the point of consumption, be that to retail customers or be that into a manufacturing environment. And the impact of that is moving away from this little and often just-in-time supply chain that we've become accustomed to over the last 20 or 30 years, I guess. The just-in-time concept, and my thought is probably we're seeing the end of that just-in-time concept as we move away from the little and often and actually start building much bigger stock of inventory close to the point of consumption. The other structural change that's really happening out there is that this whole supply chain and logistics business is moving away from being what historically has been a linear process into much more of a global supply chain ecosystem. And clearly now, with the exponential growth of e-commerce, the consumer is right at the heart of that, and driving this much more complex multi-pace, multi-channel, multi-route of inventory from sourcing markets into consumption markets. And I think the critical thing that the industry and we have to get our heads around is, as we start to build these logistics networks to support this ever-changing consumer demand, and focusing on clearly supporting consumers and that whole customer experience, actually starting to get more of our heads around what happens where do we keep stock, and actually what's the impact on the net margin cost to serve of any of those decisions that are made in that international supply chain. I think for too long now, a lot of the focus has been on the customer experience, and many of the decisions that have been made, particularly within the retail sector, have perhaps not fully understood the full cost implication of keeping this stock in multiple locations close to consumers, and really jumping through hoops to serve the consumer almost on the basis that logistics is a free service, which clearly it is not. So I see this really bringing about some structural changes, particularly in the third-party logistics sector. And I think there's huge opportunity now for the third-party logistics sector to step up and capture these opportunities. Clearly, it's shifting the emphasis on that part of the market, on the third-party logistics sector, moving some of those fairly simple, basic distribution services into much more of a complex inventory management service, with a growing and more intricate range of value-added services. And this is calling for a much greater level of flexibility and agility than we've seen in the past, with warehouses perhaps looking slightly more like order factories than the traditional. I always think that that word warehouse sort of conjures up the image of the old boy in the brown coat and the clipboard and blowing the dust off, stock that's been sitting around for some time. That's not the picture of logistics today in this high-moving, high-paced, vibrant, fast-moving business. So a lot of change that I think the third-party logistics sector has got to address. Clearly, there's a call now to put stock as close as possible to the consumers, and that's going to call for stock being held at multiple locations. And this is going to require much greater sharing of data, integration of data systems, and particularly as I say, in terms of helping customers actually understand what the cost implications are of all of this, getting much greater transparency of costs. And just to give you a picture of some of the complexity now that I think is coming more and more towards the third-party logistics sector to help their customers. I mean, this graphic, just highlighting some of the, I guess, some of the challenges that particularly retailers and manufacturers are having now. Where do I hold this stock? How do I balance up the sort of demand forecast with minimum order quantities, where Chinese factories now are not really willing to jump through hoops and produce quantities in small order quantities and ship on a kind of little and often basis. And to get that lowest cost of supply from those Far East sourcing markets, probably companies are being forced to take larger quantities than perhaps it was in the original demand forecast, and a lot of complexity around that decision making. So where does the stock go? Where do we hold it, given the fact that we've got a shortage of warehousing capacity at destination? And the other big question, of course, on many people's minds at the moment is, well, where are we going to source this from? Can I any longer run the risk of having a 6, 8, 10, 12-week lead time manufacturing from those traditional low-cost markets in the Far East, or should I actually bring this manufacturing closer to home and be sourcing nearshoring, or even bringing the manufacturing back home into the consumer market? And of course, this worldwide shortage of manpower. We talked about the driver shortage here in the UK. How do we overcome this? Is it going to be through more automation and use of robotics? I think that's a little bit of a myth that we need to dispel. I think the skills are changing within the industry, but not going away. And I don't think that automation is going to replace the number of jobs that we actually need in the industry. So that's something else that has got to be addressed. But clearly, taking an approach to more use of robotics and automation on a sort of incremental basis, in part, is something that across the board we have to look at and understand, not just the preserve of the larger players either. The cost to serve, I keep coming back to this cost of serve, understanding the impact on the net margin of this decision making, moving stock around, doubling up and trebling the amount of inventory that is being held to serve the consumer. It's not all about the transport cost. Cost of inventory on the balance sheet is probably a bigger cost than transportation. And this whole approach to flexibility of warehousing and distribution, how and where in the supply chain do I position this stock, and where do I put the added value processes in place? And then, of course, in market, the complexity of actually multiple channels to reach the consumer. Retail stores, home delivery, click and collect, and then of course the big question of returns, and how do I maximize that return process and actually get some value out of that particular process. And the other thing, of course, again, bearing in mind the cost of this, is it actually essential to provide a situation to offer same day or next day delivery, and how cost effective is that going to be, and how sustainable will that be? Or should I really be thinking about maybe giving my customer a promise and focusing my activity more on reliability, and therefore being able to build some kind of critical mass in that final mile distribution? So a very, very complex set of challenges that I think most end users are facing, and this is where I think the 3PLs have a responsibility now to step up to the plate and start helping their customers manage through some of these challenges. And surely the way forward to this is through getting increased use of technology and automation, and I do see this as being critical. And those that have followed some of my kind of thought on this through publications like SHD Logistics. I mean, earlier this year I did say, innovation twinned with data and systems will be foundational to business success. And those falling behind now will find it impossible to catch up in the future. And my big concern for the third-party logistics sector, and particularly some of the SMEs practicing in that sector, is that if they don't step up to the plate and embrace some of this, there is the risk of the sector becoming in some way an endangered species. So it's not the preserve of the big players, and I think the smaller players, the SMEs particularly, have really got to recognise this. Technology, automation, it's increasingly becoming portable. It's becoming affordable. The cloud has enabled this to be much more kind of affordable now. Subscription-based technology solutions are out there. This is not the big high-cost upfront investment that it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, before the internet from a business usage point of view was made available. And of course, the other thing is how to take some of those low-cost digital solutions by using off-the-shelf applications, voice picking using kind of Alexa type technology in the warehouse, all sorts of things. And again, back in the days at UKWA, we set up a project with Cambridge University to look at how some of those digital solutions can be secured, really just using everyday kind of smartphone and tablet type of technologies. And this is where I think the industry has got to look much deeper in terms of getting more efficient to drive this efficiency to capture some of the opportunities that are out there and help their customers manage through some of these challenges on a much more collaborative and integrated basis. So just in summary then, managing supply chain fragility, I think we have to recognise that this race to the bottom where logistics has become a free service is no longer sustainable. And maybe this is the time now, as we come out of Brexit, or Brexit gets done over the next 12 months and we come out of the pandemic, perhaps this is the time now, against an increasing focus on sustainability, that we can reset consumer expectations to understand that logistics is not a free service, and that lead times and cost have to be realistic. Because unless the logistics industry is able to increase its margin, it is simply not going to invest in that level of technology and automation and everything else that is going to be needed to drive for this greater level of efficiency. So it is about driving margins in the industry, and I think the industry has to stand together really and work on this. The shortage of labour is an ongoing issue, but simply we can't any longer rely on this low-cost labour that we've had I guess the pleasure of employing or even exploiting to a degree over the last 20 years or so, as the Eastern European labour has left us. And if we're going to bring British workers into the British logistics industry, then we've got to start paying rates that are going to be attractive to bring that labour in. And again, it comes back to logistics not being a free service. So thank you for your attention today. It's been a pleasure to share some thoughts with you. Thanks very much, and have a good day.